Good afternoon. You are all stalwarts because you're still here at 3 o'clock. We can't tell you how much we appreciate that.
Late afternoon
Yeah.
crowd. Yeah, thank you for sticking around.
We were worried we were going to talk to his wife and mine. So if you're here, you can certainly move up front. You don't have to worry about being too close. My name's Doug Miller. This is Jeffrey Brown. Jeffrey Brown is an anchor, a correspondent, an chief arts correspondent for PBS NewsHour. And I first, I guess, wanted to make sure that everybody knows what the NewsHour is. And I assume if you're here, you probably do. But maybe just tell us, because you've been there 20, 25 years, what is...
34, actually.
34 years, okay.
Yeah.
And
I started at age 13. The NewsHour is kind of a special place historically, and I guess still today. You know, it was started back in the era where there was really 3 networks, nightly news of that old style mass media that most, I think we're all of a certain age that we remember, the Walter Cronkite and then the Peter Jennings type. So the NewsHour was started, and those were half-hour shows. The NewsHour was begun with this idea of first taking one subject for a half hour, as opposed to trying to tell the entire news of the day. But then, more importantly, I think, within a few years, it turned into an hour. Nowadays, we're all used to sort of a 24-hour endless news cycle. But then, there was just the half-hour national network news. So the NewsHour was begun as a kind of alternative to that by Robin McNeil and Jim Lehrer. And I go back to for those of you who would remember McNeil-Lehrer days, I go back to McNeil in New York. It used to be McNeil in New York and Lehrer in Washington, and I was with McNeil in New York in those days. Not on television, by the way. I've had a kind of unusual arc of being a behind-the-scenes producer and then going on television. But so I go back quite a long ways with the program. So it was started as a kind of alternative, and achieved a large audience, not compared to the networks, but compared to anything else. And in an interesting way, we can talk about it if you want later, but sort of evolved as the media landscape changed, where now there's about 1 million choices, right? The NewsHour sort of maintained itself and almost went from being a kind of small niche program to a large niche program in a world where everybody's a niche program. So it's been an interesting ride.
And I want to talk about your background and get to introduce you to everybody and for them to get to know you like I kind of have over the last couple of days. But to me, there's something unique about the NewsHour. It's not a 20-second or a 1-minute snippet about the news. It seems like you take the time to develop those stories. We'll talk about what you specifically do now about the arts and culture. But is it different from the big 3 and the cable stations in that regard?
Well, I mean, we want to think so, and I think that's right. I mean, we pride ourselves on doing everything in depth and with a kind of fullness, a range of opinions and range of ideas and thoughts. And so, I mean, for one thing, just our stories are longer. I mean, that, just starting point, our stories are longer than what you're going to find, for the most part, on any other national nightly news program. So that, that makes for, hopefully, a little bit more depth, more reporting that goes into it. And then, we were historically and still are kind of known for wanting to get the widest range of opinions. Sometimes that meant, on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of discussions, sometimes to a fault, I would say, but that's what we were really known for, the kind of place where you might hear a discussion with, 2, 3, 4 people, debating something, or a longer form tape story, reported story.
And again, my observation, it's you do try to get varied opinions. It's not opinion journalism where you're looking for one side specifically. It seems like it's trying to give that broad swath.
Well, that was our MO. You know, that was always who we were, to give a wide range, and the both sides or the all sides, or whatever you want to think of it. It's a place that was really born from these two men, McNeil and Lair, and a very unusual situation, because if you think, you all know, like, a network news, and so there's CBS and ABC and there's CNN and these those are companies, right? I mean, and they have personalities, and they have anchors, and they have news people who you all know. The NewsHour was actually started and owned by McNeil and Lair. They weren't just like the anchors. They were the guys who started the thing, created the thing in their image, and with a very strong sense of what they wanted to do as journalists. And part of it was treat the audience as intelligent beings, don't tell you what to think, present to you these different viewpoints, if it's a discussion, or a highly reported, sort of deeply researched type story, if it's a tape piece, and let you decide. And, I must say, I sort of fell into this accident upon accident. Whoops, did it just go away? You can hear me? Yeah. Accident upon accident upon accident. I just sort of found myself one day with these guys, and I just felt at home right away, because their approach just felt exactly right to me.
So I do want to go back a little, because,
Okay.
Having gone to law school myself, I was fascinated when I researched about your background. So you started in college.
Doug knows more about me than I know about myself. Okay, so.
So I think you went to Berkeley, were studying classics and Greek, and then decided you weren't sure you wanted to go into that as an academic, and you picked what?
Then what did I do?
Well, I know, but I'm going to let you tell them.
No, classic sort of wayward youth without knowing what I wanted to do. Classics became, of all things, like studying ancient Greek, became a thing just when I finally got serious as a student. And I did go to Berkeley and graduate there. I met my wife studying classics over here.
Paula.
Paula, yes. And so, I did. We both considered continuing on in graduate school, but frankly, at a certain point, decided I didn't want to spend my whole life in the 5th century BC, much as we did like it. And then I did a kind of flip to, I want to live in the here and now, and I want to do something. I had never even thought about journalism at the time, but I did think of journalism then. And then I was telling you, I came up with a very ridiculously specific idea, which was that I wanted to be, the only aspiration I had in journalism was to be the Supreme Court reporter for the New York Times. There was that was it. And I also, by the way, always thought of print. I love writing. I think that's what I do best. So it was always going to be print. And so law for me was frankly like a thing to learn, to use as a journalist, not to be a lawyer. But I told you, I concocted a joint degree program between the Berkeley Law School and the Columbia Journalism School, to which they both somehow agreed. And I went to 2 years to Berkeley Law School. I went to 1 year at Columbia Journalism School. I never went back and finished my law degree. Only my mother cares at this point, but I never did it. I started working. I met at Columbia a very famous man in television journalism history. Some of you might know. His name was Fred Friendly, and he was the producer for Edward R. Murrow. I mean, he goes back to Fred's dead now, but Fred was a larger-than-life figure. George Clooney played him in the movie, Good Night and Good Luck. And I interviewed Clooney at that time, and I said, you are the least looking man like Fred Friendly. Fred was a huge, large featured everything. Hands, it was like, and he was always in your face. He was really something, and he was, a real force in television history. By the time I knew him, he was, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that because I remember, and I bet Dan remembers, back in the 70s, he did these friendly seminars.
Yeah, that's where I went to work for him.
And it was almost like a courtroom.
Yeah.
And it was kind of the same way that you learn and study the law. So I was...
Well, see, so you're putting it together. That's how it came together. I met him at Columbia. I walked into his, and he was teaching at the time and doing these seminars. And I walked in and I said, I want to work for you because I've been studying law and I know you're doing these programs and I want to do them with you. And he was, it was always like, he said, like, get out of my office. Why would I hire you? And I said, well, I studied law, I know what you're doing. I really want to do it. Get out of here. I don't need you. Blah, blah. Anyway, eventually he let me stay and I worked for him. And I ended up, he also taught a course at Columbia and I was his, TA, teaching assistant. So that was my way, when I said accidents, that was the way into television. I wasn't thinking about television, but I started producing those programs for Fred. And, with Fred Friendly, because he came from this CBS, Edward R. Murrow, kind of like no limits journalism, which meant no limits to money, no limits to access to people. As a kid, I met like the most famous people in every field with Fred. And it was quite an education because it meant that in the rest of my life since, where I am, hanging around or interviewing top people, generals or politicians or celebrities, I sort of already knew them, I knew the type, I should say, even in my 20s. And I wasn't very intimidated, in part maybe because Fred wasn't, It was like we'd go, if Fred wanted to do a program on these seminars, if it was on foreign policy, he'd say, Jeff, we're going to go meet General, Westmoreland, we're going down to Washington tomorrow. We're going to go talk to Westmoreland to be on the program, So I met Justices Scalia and Powell and, people, and Presidents Ford and Carter and others because of Fred. And so it was quite an interesting education.
So I also think it's interesting. My undergraduate was in economics. Yours was in classics. You first get hired with the NewsHour as the economic reporter.
Yes.
Then you become
of which I knew nothing.
Well,
but yeah.
Maybe I should have gone into classics. I don't know. And then you become a producer. You become a correspondent. You're on the anchor. And what I want to get to is how it transitioned to part of the show dealing with arts and culture and music, which I think originated with you. So how did that transition happen?
There was a certain point where I was still a producer and one of the top producers on the program, and producing a large chunk of things for every night's program, or overseeing the production of these things. And the arts and culture had a long history at the NewsHour because actually McNeil and Lair both were writers. So they loved it and they did it a little bit on the program, but I wanted to do more. And they let me take it on. It was just a kind of one little piece of what I was doing, but I wanted to make sure it had a big part of the program. So I will accept, some of the responsibility for giving it a much bigger place on the program. And then at a certain point, I said to them, what if I start doing it myself? That was the beginning of my being on television. It was a part-time thing for a number of years where I was just getting to do that occasionally.
So did you have a passion, though, for
I
arts
did.
and culture?
I did, yeah.
A history of being interested in that?
I'm not sure from whence it comes. Is that the, yeah? But yes, I did. And I also strongly believed from the beginning and to this day that the arts and culture are not just like this light, L-I-T-E thing that are over here, while the news is over here. For me, they should be together, and this has like been the cause that I have been pushing for 30 years, or at least 20 years, I would say, to say that, writers, musicians, artists of all kinds tell us about the world. And so if they're going to tell us about the world, I want them on a news program. And so it wasn't obvious to everybody, and it's still not really on most news programs that you would talk to a writer, say, about their work, and we still occasionally get the letters to the editor like, why do I want a poet on my news program, or why a dancer or choreographer? But I don't say it out loud unless I'm in a forum like this where I'm asked, but by example, I've been trying to make a case for this for a long time, that if you want to watch the news, then yeah, of course you know who you're going to see on our program. You're going to see politicians and CEOs and economists and what have you, because they are the newsmakers. But I want you to see artists as well and writers.
So you said something interesting. You didn't want it to be news light.
Yeah.
So what voice do you want that segment of the program to have?
Well, this has been, now it's long sort of second nature, but this was one of the big discussions we had early on was, okay, if we're going to give it a big part of the program, what is the voice? How do you pick them? How do you present the arts? And when I say I don't want it to be LITE, the thing we resolved on right away was, early on was, do it with the same substance, with the same approach as the rest of the show. Not to say that it's not heavy. I mean, it's obviously going to be a lighter, LIGHTER, part of the program. But with the same sort of repertorial approach. I talk to writers in the same way that I don't do it so much anymore, but the way I used to talk to politicians or generals, and treat them seriously. Ask the who, what, when, where type questions, probe, engage them in much the same way, and a similar kind of storytelling. So that's what I mean by that, is that it leavens the program, it lightens the program a little bit. I think it makes for a much better program, and fortunately the executive producers I've worked with, or McNeil and Lair, and then executive producers, they all agreed that this makes for a better program. So we always wanted it there. And then it's just making sure that the quality and the approach is up to the standards of everything else.
So having been a junkie of the program for years, you having done hundreds if not thousands of those, I'm sure you have favorite ones, awkward ones. I'm sure the people here have ones they'd like to ask about. But there's a couple that stuck with me, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about those.
Sure.
And the first was Linda Ronstadt. I kind of lost touch with where her life had gone.
Right, me
and
too.
then I see her on your show.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit what that was like.
Well, that's nice of you to. I mean, that was a fairly recent one, where she wrote a memoir, and I'm not exactly sure, how they connected with us or we connected with them, but I was immediately interested. I mean, like you, remember Linda Ronstadt, and wondered sort of what had happened to her, and thought our audience would be interested as well. So she has had a form of Parkinson's. It's not Parkinson's, but I can't remember the exact name. That started in the early 2000s, and that ended her career early. So she wrote the memoir about, and she's written two memoirs. This one was sort of connecting to her early life in Tucson and then along the Mexican border. So it was family history, because she's from a German-Mexican family that, in the age when crossing the border it was so easy and her family was on both sides. So that was the memoir. But as I often do when I'm talking to, especially like the biggest artists of our time, I like to talk to them about a particular new thing, the book or the movie or the album. But I like to use it as a chance to look at their entire career or, their world of being an artist. So I've done this with, many, many, many of the top writers and artists of all kinds. Use that one moment, but try to take them back. When you have someone like Linda Ronstadt already looking back for you, then it's easy. I just did an interview recently with Bono, another kind of rock star, but he had written a memoir. So I mean, that's like, for me, that's perfect, because he's looking back retrospectively at what made him, who he is today. That's what I love to do. Anyway, so we did that. We were able to do that with Linda Ronstadt, but with the caveat that she has this condition. So it was a very unusual situation. It was one where we had to, she had a caregiver. We had to sort of, I would use the word negotiate, but it's more like talk over the circumstances. How much energy does she have? How do we make her as comfortable as possible? So
It was an emotional interview.
very emotional. I
To
wasn't
her-
sure how much she wanted to talk about all of this. It was in her home in San Francisco. And, it was one of those things where she's welcoming us in. She has to sort of sit in a certain way. It was sort of even hard to make it work for the cameras and all. And, are you okay talking anytime you want to take a rest? And
It was excellent.
Thank you. It did become emotional because at a certain point, once you gain a little bit of trust or openness, then she was willing to talk about this.
And you could see that. You could see it in the interview, that she opened up and more and more.
When somebody says to you, one day I realized I'm not the same person, and they're saying that with a camera on, that's kind of, that gets kind of moving,
So I really
But
recommend.
by the way, it's television, right? So I just realized, as I said, with the camera on. So one of the most emotional moments in this, we did the interview inside, but then we went outside in her garden. And that's where she really kind of opened up. But that was actually just sort of, like extra camera stuff. That was like getting shots of the two of us sitting outside. It wasn't really the substance of the interview, but it suddenly became very moving, fast.
Yeah.
And my cameraman was moving around because he was doing what he thought he was supposed to do, just get shots. And she said something, she started speaking in this very emotional way. And I'm thinking, oh God, I hope he's getting this, because if he doesn't get it, it didn't happen, right? In my life, if the camera wasn't on, it didn't happen, right? So fortunately, he got it enough that we were able to string it together.
So there's hundreds we could talk about. I have a list here that I wanted to talk about, but I want to get to his book that he wrote, a book of poetry. But I just recommend you go on YouTube and you can look them up and see them for years. And they're just fascinating. They're just really good in the way that you bring out the arts and you bring it so it's not news light. I love that. So this is his book of poetry. It's called The News, Poems. So
Very creative title.
So had you always written poetry, or why a book of poetry? Why
Well,
everyone seems to write novels?
I had written, I know everybody writes novels. I had written some in my wayward youth and long ago. And then over the years, I would take notes and I would very occasionally write what felt like poems. I never wanted to put them out in the world, though, one by one anyway. I mean, in part because I knew too many actual poets, and a lot of them were really good friends of mine. And I thought, what the hell am I going to, contribute to this? But I kept writing, and at a certain point, it kind of hit me that there was a sort of theme that I was writing to, which was sort of, you could call them news poems in a way. I was writing a lot about my experiences as a journalist. And then suddenly it sort of made sense to me what I was doing with poetry. And then I thought, okay, I thought about a book. It wasn't like just writing a poem by poem, but if I could come up with a thing that, and I did like right away sort of call it the news in my head, then I thought, okay, I'm willing to present myself in this way to the world in a way that I won't feel too strange about, but either to our audience or to my friends who are poets. So that's sort of how it all came about.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you to read some of the poems. I mean,
Okay,
they're in your voice,
Yeah.
and then you can kind of tell us what your voice was
Sure.
and what you were saying. A lot of them do relate to the news and
Yeah.
are kind of questions I was going to ask you about how you get prepared for
Okay.
a news story.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that I don't know that I've ever read a dedication and then decided, oh my gosh, this is going to be a great book just because of the dedication. But in this book, you had me from the dedication.
Thank you.
So
Thank
if you could read that and kind of tell
Well,
us.
okay, I'll read it first, and then I'll tell you about it. It's called Dedication. To the porter in a Tucson hotel who took my bag and asked, "Do you yourself love poetry?" Uniformed, night-shifted, a man crossing borders in the satellite's beam, and now, he said, a reader of poems. Chance and change in a desert hotel. Imagine him there, the porter, imagining a wider world, and you in it, you carried in it. So this is about a real thing that happened to me in a Tucson hotel, where the man came up to take my bag at the hotel, and he suddenly said something to me that made me realize he knew who I was. Now, that happens in my life pretty regularly, but, it's nice when it's not just like people at a book festival. It's nice when it's the people working at a hotel. That tells you that, who the audience can be. By the way, we were talking last night about me being in prisons to do stories, and this was actually when that happened in Arizona. So what was wonderful about this was that the man said to me, he said he had never read poetry before until he watched me interviewing poets on the NewsHour. So that was deeply moving, and he said, now I'm into poetry. So, as a man who's working and doing, bringing me the room service in my room. And so I had him in mind, and, the references here, the satellite's beam, the television, obviously, and me imagining the porter out there in the world, because sometimes I'm sitting in the studio thinking, who is out there actually watching, and here's a porter. Now, I'm going to tell you one other funny thing about this. Recently, I'll drop a name on you here, but Yo-Yo Ma, you've all heard of him. I've, gotten to know him over the years, and we're kind of friends, and sometimes he's asked to do something like this in front of an audience and give a talk, and he asked me to come and we do a live conversation together for an audience. And the last time we did this, he said, he always has his cello, of course, and we we have a little fun thing we do where, we talk for a little bit and then he plays something and we talk. So he said to me, before we went on, he said, what if you read one of your poems and I just kind of riff, I improvise?
Oh my gosh.
Yo-Yo Ma, improvising, right? So he said, so I called Paula, I didn't have my book with me, And I said, Yo-Yo wants to improvise a poem. Quick, send me something. And I thought of this one. So I read this in front of this was like an arena, like, a few thousand people. And Yo-Yo sat there and played. And I finished the poem, and then he continued into a Bach sonata. So that was a pretty good life experience.
That is, what an honor.
Yeah.
So don't put the book down.
Okay.
One of the questions I was going to ask you, because we're talking to you and about your career, was, kind of what your day is like and how you decide what goes on the news and how you decide what you say and write. So maybe you could read either nightly news or song lead story. Or if you have time and you want, you could read them both, because they tell us kind of a little bit of a look behind the Wizard of Oz curtain. They're on page 7 and 8.
Okay, so nightly news. Consider the camera, its gaze as long as the cloudless night, focused yet false, distorted. Hear the story of the air, the voices straining to breathe, the sound of sand sifting away. Ask yourself the questions: who, what, when, where, and why is the sky suddenly ash? Why the laughter? Why the dead? What the children said when asked who and where and why. Clarity, cliché, polished package that wraps the unwrappable. Here it is, your day. So that's me thinking about what it is to do a nightly newscast. Here it is. I'm sitting there every night. Again, this is not my life so much anymore, but for many years it was sitting in a studio. Good evening, here's the news, right? Now, what the hell am I doing? What am I saying to you? Like, here's your day. Here's what happened. How are we packaging it? How do we do it in a way that's clear and not cliche? And why this story and why not that story? These are the things this was my life for many, many years, is the editorial meetings where we have so much going on in any particular day. We have to decide which stories we're going to do.
So can you read Haiti next? It's on page 10.
Page 10?
What I like about Haiti is it talks a little bit, I think, about one of the shows that you did, an arts and culture show. So read that.
Okay, well, this is from a trip to Haiti after the earthquake. Okay, so the first, I'll just tell you since you can't see, the first line is in quotes. I mean, one of the things I do in the poem sometimes is I take actual quotes from people I interview. Sometimes they were things that actually appeared in the television story, sometimes not. So the very first line very first line and very last line is in quotes. Haiti. Epidemiologically, this area is terrifying. La Saline, the giant slum, on a sun-soaked, shit-soaked morning as the children filled their buckets from a makeshift well. The pigs scavenged while a rat watched all. Why bother to hide? La Saline, somewhere nearby, the assaulted, salted sea. Days later, the last light high in the central plateau, so far, so bone-crushed by the road, I'd argued against going, the town of Sot-Doo. They filled the benches and told us of death upon death. A man who'd lost his son said to me, I am a bird left without a branch to land on. So, a man actually said that, after talking about losing his child. This was a particularly awful situation of people dying from cholera. Yeah. This was after the earthquake, and then, as though that wasn't enough, there was a cholera outbreak. So.
And tell us about the writers you met in Haiti.
Well, I mean, some of the most meaningful experiences I've had as a journalist are being able to travel around the world. and go to places. Great socks, by the way. I didn't.
The Rolling Stones.
To travel around the world and go to places that that we would all see on the news, but usually only for one thing, or under the category of disaster, which is to say war, famine, I don't know, earthquake, something like that, something terrible. To go to these places and, yes, cover that, but also to make sure to bring in the culture and the arts aspect to it. Because going back to what I said earlier, it's very important to me that we as Americans know about our writers and artists, but also that we understand more about the world. And the way to one way to understand that is through the world's writers and artists. So wherever I go, I do that. In Haiti, again, it was this period after the earthquake and cholera, and still a very terrible situation. But I did several stories for our program, including some with some prominent writers and a painter. And one of the scenes was this amazing group of. It was in a library, but it was an amazing group of people that came together from all over Port-au-Prince every Saturday. They had been doing this for years. Writers, painters, and just regular people who loved reading, and they would come together and they would read together, and they would read classics of Haitian and French, because there's French and Creole, but also American and European, all kinds of literature. So they just lovers of literature, right? So it's a side of Haiti that whoever sees that in the nightly news, we just don't think of. All we ever think of with Haiti is there's another coup or there's an earthquake. So I love seeing this, and in the context I saw it was even more amazing because there was so much rubble everywhere you couldn't get anywhere. So somehow they all came together, and still came to do this. So it was quite a remarkable scene.
So we probably remembered back during the Iraq War the honor roll that you had on the show. Can you read us, I think it's called Army Private JG, Iraq 2006. It's on page 81.
Sure. Now this was a Jim Lair idea that I should say I didn't agree with him at the beginning. His idea was that this was as the Iraq War and Afghanistan were happening, that at the end of the program, he came up with the idea, the honor roll, and this is very McNeil Lair, like don't do a sort of maudlin, don't overdo it. Just put up the picture of the person who's died, the name and the service, and where they were mostly young men, of course, but not all, where that soldier was from. And do it in silence. Who does that on television? So the honor roll became this thing. And at first, I didn't quite know what he was doing, but it was remarkable. People really, it was very, very moving. So I was so moved by it myself. I wrote a series of poems that I called honor roll. These are all made up. So these are not real people. This is me imagining the life of people. Which one did you wanted? Army Specialist?
Yes, on page 81.
81. Army Private JG, Iraq 2006. His last ride, the airport into town, shotgun in the armored plated vehicle, hunk of junk, strap in, hold on. Could barely hear himself think or scream. Go ahead, scream. And this he loved on the roller coaster back home, arms flapping, hair raised. Saw movement in the shadow just before the explosion hit. Amusement park my ass, he said, tasting metal in a foreign ditch. Like a dog that rushes into the waves, eyes shining, fur flying, until the sea rises up and takes him away. So there's a series of those about me sort of imagining the last minute moment of a person as they're dying, thinking back a little bit to their lives or their loved
So you
ones.
wrote 5 of them in there. All of
Uh,
them are as
I
good
wrote-
as the next one.
thank you.
Where did they come from?
Well, they came from this idea of watching the honor roll and seeing, as I said, one of the genius ideas that Jim had in this was that you would only give the most minimal description. And you wouldn't, it's not like a full obituary where we're interviewing somebody and there's music playing. And it allowed your imagination to work, My goodness, look how young that guy is. And he's from, I don't know, Joplin, Missouri or something. And, oh yeah, I was there once. And, I imagine his mother at that moment and, thinking about, I don't know, I think that's what the audience did when we were running them on the air, and that's what it became for me.
So I have one other.
Okay.
I told you I wanted you to read this one last night. It's called Succession.
Uh-huh.
Maybe you can tell us what it involves.
Well, this
It's
is
on
one of
page
the
65.
one of the more personal ones. This is about my father.
And I appreciate you reading it.
Thank you.
Did I
where
get the
where
page
did
right?
it- Oh, 60, yes.
65.
Yeah, I mean, some of these are, this is just certainly, of course, one of the more personal. It's about my father's death and his funeral. And Robert Pinsky, by the way, who was a good friend and became my helper in this sort of, the best experience of doing this book was getting to work. I told him he was the first person I sort of said, I ventured to say, what if I showed you some poems? And he said, anything you want. And the best experience of the whole thing was going through it. He said, do you want me to read whole poems? Do you want to go through it line by line, word by word, whatever? And I said, well, if you want to go word by word, I'll do it. And we had these amazing sessions of being I got to be in his personal poetry class. Anyway, I mention it because he came up with the title Succession. Succession. One morning, state police escort us to your grave. The next, my flight is canceled. Maintenance issues breaking out all over. You would speak of a grand theory, something tying all this together, but you had none yourself, none that reached me then or now, as I drive your car slowly into the tranquil streets of my youth. Here is where I learned to ride a bike on this high hill that is no hill at all. And still I fell. And now you descend, and still I fall. And here is where I learned to doubt, in the chapel where we donned black skull caps that meant nothing, I tell you. If God speaks, it is elsewhere. And here are my own children, rooted and uncertain, watching me speak to you. You watched the news every night, worried if I did not make air, traveling, sick, useless, lost. Now that you are gone, traffic parted by the state police, can I too disappear? So,
Thank you.
thank you for asking that.
Are you still writing poetry?
Yes, it's a sort of a sad subject for me at the moment. I mean, I am, but again, in the same way, I thought I only want to do this if it's another book, and I actually sort of came up with, and I wanted to try something different and not write more sort of news poems. I actually wrote what I thought of almost as like I created some characters. I pretty much wrote a full book, and then I decided I didn't like it. So I'm still kind of sitting with it to see if I can rejigger it to make it work and in a way that satisfies me. I mean, I always, I don't know. I have a day job, and I don't really need to do it. I would love to. I loved the experience of it, and I I love being out in the world this way to talk about it, you know, and because it's a different thing for me. But I also just want it to feel right. So.
Well, it's been an honor to meet you, an honor to meet your wife and spend time with you.
Thank you very
Your
much.
book
I
is-
appreciate all the prep. This is good interviewing. Really
Well,
good
thank you very much.
preparation. Thank you all.